Welcome to Using SQL Compare with SQL Change Automation. I'm Kendra Little from Redgate Software. In this video, we're going to talk about the SQL Compare engine, but there is one thing that you should know. When you use SQL Change Automation, you are using the SQL Compare engine behind the scenes, even if you aren't aware of it. The SQL Compare engine gets used for lots of things that happen in SQL Change Automation, like figuring out, hey, has someone been making changes to your development database outside of Visual Studio? Because you can import changes that way as well. It gets used to generate baseline scripts. It's at work a lot, but it can be also useful for you to occasionally use the standalone SQL Compare tool in conjunction with SQL Change Automation. And let's take a look at a demo of how that works with our Northwind solution. I have my solution with the Northwind sample database open here, and I have already been doing a little bit of work. But let's say that I've lost a little bit of track of the state of things, and I want to compare an environment that exists somewhere and see, does it match what I've got in my SQL Change Automation project? Well, I can perform that comparison with SQL Compare. I'm going to go to my Windows menu and type SQL and get SQL Compare to show up on my app screen there, and go ahead and open it up. And I can compare a lot of different things with SQL Compare. I can compare databases to databases. One of the comparisons that I can do is from a SQL Change Automation project. So in my setup here, I get to specify a source and a target. And under the source, way down there at the bottom, I am going to click that button for a SQL Change Automation project file. There's a very helpful little tooltip here about the SQL Change Automation project. And it lets us know that, by the way, when we look at this, we are only looking at your offline schema model and your programmable objects. This is actually good news. You don't want this compare project to have to say, oh, I am going to deploy every single migration script in your project to perform a compare. That could take more than a second. We want this to be fast. So as long as we've been using our offline schema model and programmable objects and keeping them in sync with our project, which is definitely desirable, they can be very, very useful to use for this comparison. And that means that we can rely on them instead of using the migration scripts. We don't want to use those migration scripts for this. Now, do note that it isn't like any pre-deployment scripts or post-deployment scripts. If you've put custom code in there and you care about that in terms of the comparison, that's not going to be reflected in this. In those cases, performing the comparison, you could use something like either the PowerShell scripts with the SQL Change Automation commandlets, or plugins to say, oh, I am going to deploy this and compare the result of that if you do have code in there that you want to use. And in that case, you would just compare database to database. So in this case, I just want to do a really quick comparison using those programmable objects in the offline schema model. So I am going to say I want to use Northwind as my source, and let's go ahead and compare it to that QA database that's on beep beep dev. So I'm going to go ahead and select Northwind QA as my target database and compare my programmable objects and my offline schema model with that QA database. Now I have deployed a migration script after I deployed my baseline, and I have for the changes I've been pushing them through to that QA environment. So after my results come through here, I can see that I have 3 objects that are only in the Northwind QA database that aren't shown as reflected in my schema or in my offline schema model and my programmable objects. And if we look at what these are tables used by SQL Change Automation when it deploys to track what migrations have I deployed and where are we with this database. So it's very normal that I would have those differences. I can see that I have 59 identical objects as well. Well, what if I wanted to compare it not with my current state of SQL Change Automation, but what if I wanted to compare it with my baseline? I'm going to look at my history down here. I'm going to view the history, and I have only been using a master branch in here. Well, let's say I do want to create a branch for that commit where I committed my initial baseline and created the project. I'm going to enter the branch name here of baseline, and we're not going to talk too much about different branching models or whether you should use release branches or feature branches in here. That's a little bigger than the scope of this video, but I just want to show you that if I do have this branch created, and so I've got the baseline branch now, and the baseline branch, I now have it as active down here. Now notice, now that I've switched branches, I've switched from master to baseline. And baseline only contains it does not contain refactoring customer order detail or refactoring the index on customers. If I refresh this history, here is baseline. Baseline goes up to here. So now that I'm in baseline, the SQL Change Automation window is like, hey, your development environment does not match where we're at in source control. Because in my Solution Explorer, note that I don't have migration scripts in here. There are changes I had not made at this point. So by switching to that branch, I have traveled in time backwards a little bit. Going now into SQL Compare, if I refresh this, now notice I didn't hit deploy. I actually didn't bring my local developer database up to speed, but I did switch to baseline, which has the programmable objects and the offline schema model from a certain point in time. At this point, when I compare, I can see now that I have two objects that are in SQL Change Automation and in the QA database, but they are different. Let's get our little scroller ball up here. In SQL Change Automation, the customers table, when the baseline was created, it had an index named postal code on it. Whereas now the QA database, it has an index with a different name. And if I scroll to the right, I can see, ooh, yeah, it's got an included column in there that was not there before. So, oh yeah, okay, that wasn't in the baseline. And if I click on that customer orders detail procedure, I can see the refactoring changes I made to there. So we do have to be careful with this, right? Because it's not representing the pre-deployment script and post-deployment scripts. But if I'm not putting a lot of complex logic in there that needs to be involved in my comparison, I can very easily use SQL Compare to, let's go now back to present now. Let's go back to the master branch, which I've been using. SQL Change Automation immediately looks and is like, oh, actually, you don't have any pending changes after all. My bad. And I clicked refresh again for fun because I am a frequent refresher. It's like, oh no, you now at the head of the master branch, you are in sync with your development database, which is still Northwind dev. And now if I go back and refresh my compare, it will see that I am fully in sync with the QA database except for those migration tables there. So it can be very, very useful to use SQL Compare, whether you're comparing a database you have deployed to with SQL Change Automation, or if you do want to compare your SQL Change Automation project using that offline schema model and programmable objects, you can compare that to a database, a scripts folder, lots of different things as well. I'm Kendra Little. Thanks for joining me for this video about SQL Change Automation.